The cafe where this strange situation eventually unfolded was a small neighborhood place on the corner of Maple Avenue and 3rd Street, the kind of quiet local cafe that didn't attract tourists or influencers, but instead relied on the steady routine of regular customers who stopped in every morning for coffee before work. And for nearly 2 years, my own routine had followed the same predictable pattern because I worked remotely as a freelance editor and preferred to start my day outside my apartment. So each weekday morning at around 7 o'clock, I would walk through the glass door of that cafe with my laptop bag over my shoulder, greet whoever was behind the counter, order a simple black coffee and sometimes a bagel, and then settle into the same booth by the window where the sunlight came through the hanging plants and created a calm atmosphere that made it easier for me to concentrate while editing documents or answering emails. The booth itself was nothing special in terms of design, just a wooden table with padded seats on either side placed against the front window that overlooked the street. Yet it had quietly become my preferred spot because it was far enough from the counter to avoid the constant noise of the espresso machine, but close enough to the window that I could occasionally glance outside and watch the early commuters passing by. And the employees had grown so used to seeing me there that they often started preparing my coffee the moment I walked through the door, which meant that over time my presence had become just another small part of the cafe's daily rhythm alongside the elderly couple who shared a pastry every morning and the college student who spent hours studying near the back wall. For a long time, nothing about that routine attracted any attention or concern, because cafes are exactly the kind of places where people naturally settle into habits. Yet one Monday morning, a woman I had never seen before entered the cafe while I was already halfway through reviewing a document on my laptop and sipping my coffee, and although at first she seemed like any other new customer looking around for a place to sit, the moment her eyes landed on the booth where I was sitting, she paused in a way that immediately felt different from the casual glances most people gave the room when they entered. She stood near the counter with her drink in hand while slowly scanning the cafe again. Yet every few seconds her gaze returned to my table with a narrowed expression. That made me wonder if perhaps she had wanted that particular booth herself and was annoyed to find it occupied, which would have been understandable if the cafe had been crowded. But at that moment, several other empty tables were available, including one directly beside the window, only a few feet away from me. At first, I didn't think much about it and returned to my work, assuming she would simply choose another seat and forget about it. Yet after a minute or two, she walked directly toward my booth and stopped beside the table in a way that felt strangely confrontational for such an ordinary situation. "Do you always sit here?" she asked suddenly, her voice carrying a tone that sounded less like casual curiosity and more like suspicion, which immediately caught me off guard, because it was not the kind of question strangers usually ask someone quietly working on a laptop in a cafe. I looked up from the screen and answered honestly that yes, I usually did sit there most mornings because I came early before work and liked the light near the window, expecting that explanation to end the conversation just as easily as it had begun. Instead, she frowned slightly and looked around the cafe as though verifying something in her mind, before speaking again in a way that sounded oddly serious. "That's what I thought," she said slowly, tightening her grip on the coffee cup she was holding. "I've been coming here all week, and every single morning you've been sitting in this exact booth, watching the street." The accusation felt so strangely dramatic that I actually laughed a little, before realizing she was completely serious, and I explained that I worked remotely as an editor and simply liked to start my day in the cafe while reviewing documents on my laptop, which meant I usually arrived at the same time and naturally chose the same seat because it was comfortable and familiar. For a brief moment, she seemed to consider that explanation, yet the skeptical look on her face suggested she was not satisfied by something that simple, as she leaned slightly closer to the table while glancing toward the window behind me as though she believed my quiet routine must have some hidden motive. "You know, people who sit in the same place every morning watching the street can make others uncomfortable," she said in a tone that implied she believed she was pointing out something obvious, even though the cafe around us was filled with other customers who clearly had not noticed anything unusual about my presence. I tried to respond calmly by explaining that I wasn't watching anything at all and was simply working while drinking coffee. And for a moment, I thought the conversation might finally end, when she gave a short nod and walked away to a table near the entrance, though every few minutes I could feel her eyes drifting back toward my booth as if she were still analyzing my behavior from across the room. Over the next several days, the same pattern repeated itself, because she appeared in the cafe every morning at roughly the same time and always reacted with visible irritation when she saw me already sitting in the booth by the window, occasionally whispering something to the barista or glancing at me with a suspicious expression. That made the entire situation feel increasingly uncomfortable despite the fact that I had done absolutely nothing unusual. The staff never seemed concerned because they knew I had been a regular customer for years. Yet the tension continued building until one Friday morning when the situation escalated in a way that none of us expected. That morning I had just opened my laptop and taken my first sip of coffee when the woman walked into the cafe and immediately stopped near the entrance after spotting me in the booth again. And this time, her reaction was far more dramatic than before because she marched across the room with her phone already in her hand and an expression that suggested she had decided something had to be done. "This is getting ridiculous," she said loudly enough that several customers looked up from their drinks in surprise. "You're here every single morning sitting in the same booth, staring out that window like you're watching something." The accusation was so strange that for a moment I didn't even know how to respond, and I tried once again to explain that I was simply working on my laptop before starting the rest of my day. Yet instead of listening, she stepped back and began dialing a number on her phone with determined urgency. "You know what? I'm calling someone about this because it's suspicious," she announced dramatically. And before anyone in the cafe could react, she raised the phone to her ear and said the words that made the entire room fall into stunned silence. "Yes, hello. I'd like to report a suspicious person who has been occupying the same booth in this cafe every morning and watching the street outside," she said into the phone, clearly speaking to a 911 dispatcher while several customers exchanged confused looks across the room. The barista behind the counter looked completely shocked because calling the police over someone sitting in a cafe booth sounded absurd. Yet the woman continued describing me as though she had discovered something dangerous while pacing near the entrance and occasionally pointing toward my table. Within about 10 minutes, a police officer walked through the cafe door, and the moment he stepped inside, the woman hurried toward him with an animated explanation about how I had been sitting in the same booth every morning monitoring the street, which made a few customers quietly shake their heads in disbelief. The officer listened patiently before approaching my table and asking what I was doing there. And when I explained that I worked remotely and came to the cafe every morning to edit documents while drinking coffee, he glanced at the laptop on the table, the stack of printed pages beside it, and the half-eaten bagel next to my cup. After a brief pause, he nodded slowly and turned back toward the woman with a calm expression that suggested he already understood the situation perfectly. "Ma'am," he said politely, "sitting in the same booth at a cafe every morning is not illegal, and a lot of regular customers prefer a particular seat when they come in." The tension in the room immediately dissolved as a few customers chuckled quietly, and the woman's confident posture quickly shifted into visible embarrassment when she realized that the officer was not taking her accusation seriously. After offering a brief explanation about how cafes often have regular customers who follow the same routine each day, the officer wished everyone a good morning and left, while the woman quickly gathered her things and walked out of the cafe without finishing her drink. I stayed in the booth by the window finishing my coffee and returning to my work, and as I watched the morning traffic move along Maple Avenue outside the glass, I couldn't help thinking about how something as simple as sitting in the same comfortable spot every morning had somehow turned into a police call simply because one stranger decided that routine must be suspicious. And even though the entire situation had been ridiculous, I returned to that same booth the following Monday because by that point it had firmly become my place in the quiet rhythm of the cafe's everyday life.